What's up, RPG people? This is BardicCollege.com, and today we are going to talk about hex crawling. With me today on the journey is going to be John Stater. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you.
Before we get into it, I just wanted to talk about your work. You've made quite a few OSR games. Looks like more than 9. And you also have a magazine you publish quarterly and a blog.
Yeah, well, roughly quarterly. I try to do that. I think I get more like 3 a year, but yeah.
Bardic College is all about storytelling, great storytelling. And what I've seen is that hex crawling seems to be a lost art of RPGs. Um, I personally have never been in one, and I started back in the mid '90s with second edition AD&D, and so it seems to have kind of gone onto the sidelines for quite a while. Is there any reason you feel like that's the case?
I don't know. I got into gaming in about 1984, and honestly, I was in like sixth grade, junior high. So we primarily at the time would just pick a TSR module and run through it, and at that age probably cheat a lot and get all the magic items and then go to the next one. I think I got into the hex crawl concept really much later, maybe about 10 years ago, when I started doing more campaign design for the people I played with and was trying to figure out a good way to bring the whole world into the game in a way that was manageable. So I started off just with, well, I'll draw a map and I'll just sort of write some stuff up on this particular area. And I'll make up 3 or 4 things that people might encounter, and just found that it didn't really work that well. It wasn't enough, within a session or two. I'd kind of run through the 10 or 11 encounters that I came up with. So then, looking into more of the old school stuff, I found where people had once done these kind of hex crawls, and I thought, oh, that might be a good way to do it. And so took the maps that I'd made, turned them into hex maps, and then just started doing it. And this is about the time I started my blog. My initial idea at the time was I'll do the hex crawl in the blog.
And that's
So
the blog is the Land of
that's
Nod.
Land of Nod. Yeah, Land of Nod. So I figured, well, I'll do a post and it'll be some of the encounters, and then I'll do another one on the. Well, I mean, geez, you figure out pretty quickly on that each of those hex maps is going to hold, I don't know, 400 or 500 encounters on it. So putting it into a blog format just was not really that realistic. So that's when I said, well, maybe I'll make a little magazine called Nod, and I'll work with that.
Right on. So, when you personally are running a hex crawl, how do you start that adventure?
In some ways, kind of the same way you might any other adventure. You could have everybody meeting at a tavern or an inn. You could be more creative too and have everybody, I don't know, wake up out in the middle of a desert and have to try to figure out their way out of it. But it doesn't have to be anything in particularly different than a normal adventure. You got your starting point. I think that the thing that changes more is the destination, which instead of, oh, there's an old ruin, 2 hours out of town that you're going to go visit, it's a little bit more, here's some rumors about this region, and then the characters get to pick where they want to try to go and have to figure out how to get there alive in one piece, and then do what they're going to do.
Yeah, that's kind of the big difference that I've seen so far between hex crawling and doing overland travel without the hex crawls. There's pros and cons to every decision you could make.
Yeah, yeah, and I think for some players it might be a little bit too much. I mean, because you literally, if you're talking about having a whole world to explore, you can start heading off in any direction, and you can go an awful long way. So that's why the concept of rumors or setting up a few ideas for players to follow up on is sometimes useful. Narrows the focus for them a little bit, so they don't feel overwhelmed. But if you get the right group of players who really like that kind of thing, I think it's great because, again, assuming you've stocked up the hex map with a lot of things to see and do, some folks are going to like that. It just becomes a matter of let's see what's out there. I mean, let's see
Yeah,
what's hidden.
that brings us to a good point of that I've seen a lot of rancor about hex crawling. It seems that most DMs don't really do it the right way. And one thing that I've seen is that there aren't enough encounters. That there aren't enough hexes with things to do in them or things to experience. Maybe not even combat encounters.
That which is true. Which is true. I mean, there there are going to be a lot of empty spaces out there. I mean, the average hex crawl I'm doing is maybe I don't know 70 to 80 wide by 40 to 45. Tall. If I was going to write an encounter for every one of those hexes, I'd either still be working on the first one, or I would have to keep it just absolutely bare bones. 3 skeletons are in this hex, and this hex has a old treasure chest in it, and that's it. I mean, if you're going to put a little more depth into it, you can't do one for everything. Now, of course, if you're running it, you could always add things. And I'll be honest, when I run things with players, whether it's a hex crawl or a dungeon thing or whatever, I try to pay attention to what they're doing. And, sometimes you get to a point where they've convinced themselves that there's something to find here. And I know there isn't. I didn't write that down. But you go, why not? Maybe there should be something. And so you just start making it up on the fly and kind of give them what they thought they were going to find in the first place. So, if you stay kind of open ended and loose with it, you could maybe fill in. You also have the wandering encounters, that you can bring. But, you know, the thing you got to be careful about is if you're throwing an awful lot at the players, they're probably not going to survive. I mean, the monsters always sort of have the upper hand because man, they're showing up all over the place, and nobody cares if they last to the next adventure, so they can really go to town on people.
Do you
And
find that to
I
be
found that.
true? Do you find that to be true for both OSR and the later edition?
I mean, I played up to third edition. I haven't played any of the stuff after that really, so I couldn't speak to those. Yeah, I mean, it could be true for any edition. I mean, if you're rolling random encounters and you're in the wilderness, you're generally not going to run into like a group of 6 orcs like might be walking down a hall of a dungeon. There's a good chance if you've randomized it out, it's going to be a much larger group. So first and foremost, the hex crawls are generally going to be for higher level parties. I mean, if you look at old D&D, you had the basic set levels 1 to 3, and that was primarily focused on dungeon crawls. That's where players were going to kind of cut their teeth, get a little power, whatever. The expert set was where they said, "Oh, by the way, you can make entire worlds with hex maps." They weren't exactly hex crawls, but that's where they introduced the idea of the wilderness adventures. Just because you need some levels under your belt before you can start tackling some of these bigger challenges. And if you're running into an entire tribe of orcs or something like that, obviously you'd hope the players are going to be smart enough to try to run away
That's
and
interesting.
sneak off.
I had noticed that the hex crawls that I've looked at that you've done are keyed for much higher level characters than I would have thought. I thought you could do hex crawling with any level. You just have to scale it up
Well,
and
I mean,
down.
you could if you scaled it the way you could, yeah. But I mean, trying to write an entire hex crawl for first level players, I mean, that's going to be tough. Like I said, you're probably doing anywhere to from 3 to 500 encounters on one of these big maps. I mean, doing a dungeon with 20 rooms in it for a first level group, it's not too tough. 20 things that are going to scale more or less for that group of players. You try to write 400 encounters, that are primarily focused on 2 orcs or a few giant rats showing up. That's going to be hard. That's going to be tough.
Okay.
If you're talking about a lower level group, you're probably starting them in some town, village, city, whatever, with a dungeon nearby. They can start, earning some experience and all that kind of thing. But let them know that there is other stuff out there, and they can make some little forays out into the wilderness. Test the waters. Again, there's always a certain amount with these things of the person running the game knowing who they're running it for, and the page may say, this hex has 20 orcs in it, blah 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 blah. You could always go, okay, I got a lower level party. We're going to call it 6 orcs, and we're going to narrow it down a little bit. I mean, I think most DMs probably do that on a lot of things. Is you want to challenge people, you don't want to wipe them out necessarily, and especially if they're not playing foolishly. If you've given them 50 clues that they're heading into something super dangerous, and the group says we're going to keep going, we're going to keep going. Well, then at some point you go, all right, well, here's the danger, and you're probably all going to get wiped out, and that's life. There's always got to be a certain amount of players being smart and looking at the clues, which I know can be a change from the old school to the new school, where new school is a little more designed for everything's supposed to be geared for this group of people and where they're at. They should be able to win every encounter.
The old school dungeon crawls that I've seen seem to be more geared towards wilderness survival during the hex crawl.
Mm-hmm.
And so rationing, light sources, like the process of when you camp, who's in front, who's scouting, all of that stuff kind of plays in. Marshall McLuhan, he said that the medium is the message. And so that got me to thinking, well, how does hex crawling change the story that you tell?
Well, that's a good question. I suppose it somewhat depends on the story you're telling. I think maybe an element of it may be sort of the idea of that. It's overused, but the idea of the hero's journey, right? Here you're dealing with, well, like the Jason and the Argonauts or Odysseus. Odysseus isn't just in a place doing a thing. Odysseus is starting in one place and trying to get to another, and all these challenges are coming up along the way. Now, I suppose you could do something like that in a dungeon setting. It's going to be a little less broad, but it's more room to room rather than island to island. But I think it really works well in a hex crawl setting. You get an idea that there's this huge world out there. There's a lot of things to explore, a lot of dangers. Who knows what there is out there? It gives you a good place to hide all the cool stuff. It gives you a lot of other characters for people to interact with. And that in and of itself can create whole new adventures, where you got some prince in some castle and everybody rolls up and they meet him. And it could be a 5-second encounter of, he says, hello, welcome, get off my land. And they go, oh, you better get off this land. It could spin into something else. But a lot of that comes down to what are the DM and what are the players there for? You got a bunch of players who just want to get in fights and kill stuff and take their things. You're not gonna have a lot of story anyways necessarily. You got players who like to get into it and really, and a DM who knows how to encourage that kind of thing. It could go a lot further.
Do you find that people who are into the OSR are really looking for player agency? Is that what they're there for?
It sounds like it, but God, man, there's so many different kinds of players, of every kind of edition. And that's maybe the hardest thing about being a dungeon master is trying to learn who your players are, figure out the things that they want to see in different games, and give them the opportunity to have those kind of interactions that they want without overloading it one direction or the other. And of course, on the player side, it's understanding what the other players want out of the game and making sure, you may not be into the big fights, but the guy next to you is. So when you get into a big fight, try to get into it because he's enjoying himself. And meanwhile, you like having these interactions with these NPCs and blah, 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 blah. And the guy next to you really doesn't care, but he needs to go, hey, this is this person's thing. I'm going to help him get into it. I'm going to try to enjoy it, So, I think that's why role-playing games are so much fun, is that it isn't just a matter of here's the board, move around, do what's on each space. Everybody's bringing different things to this game. And if you're doing it right, everybody's having a good time. You're maybe getting a little out of your own comfort zone, but you're also getting to have the things you really dig, and I think that's why they're so much fun. They can go so many different directions. They can be mysteries. They could be, horror. It could be straight up, fighting all the time. It could be some guy wants to find tons of gold pieces so he can build a castle. I mean, it could go all sorts of places, and hex crawls I think work with that, maybe a little better than the dungeon crawl does, because it is it's a place, and you're going deeper, but still there's going to be an end to it. And when you're dealing with the hex crawls, there's almost no end to it. I mean, depending on how far the DM wants to map things out and set things up.
I have a question, and you might know the answer since you started playing in the mid 80s. Hex crawling was more prevalent in the beginning, maybe the first edition AD&D, but then it seems to have kind of been done away with, eschewed, as it were.
It's outrageous.
But what's the reason for that, do you think? That it was so popular in the beginning and then it went away?
Well, I mean, I think the answer there might be you start off with a bunch of wargamers, right? That's where this starts. And wargamers, they need a place to have wars, which means you need to go outdoors. So the dungeon concept is make all your gold. Eventually, you get your experience level high enough. You go outside, you build a stronghold, you have an army. Your friend has one too, and now you're going to go ahead and pit your armies against each other, right? And I think they were a little more into that concept of going outdoors and doing something. Then you get a bunch of little snot-nosed brats like me playing in '84 when I'm 12. Yeah, dude, that's way above me, And the idea of, see, these guys loved like logistics and stuff, right? Okay, well, it's going to take us 3 weeks to get from here to there. So we're going to need all these iron rations and blah, blah, blah. And we got to get hay for the horse. And you're 12. It's like, dude, I just want to kill stuff. And I want to, find jewels and whatever and rescue people. Like, I don't, that's too much, right? So the game kind of started getting dominated, I think, by the younger kids at a certain point. I mean, I bought all my original stuff at Toys R Us, which really dates me now that Toys R Us is closing. But so I wasn't up for that stuff yet. Maybe by the '90s I was, because I was in college and stuff. But again, it also wasn't something I'd done much with. So I think you kind of had that torch passed to a new generation, and that kind of changed what was marketable, right? Because at that point, TSR, they're not just having fun in the basement; they're running a large business, And so we need to do something that these people are going to buy. Fast forward to Wizards of the Coast, and they're doing third edition. Again, not much in the way of hex crawling. So if you're going to start going back to the old school, at some point you're probably going to start looking at the hex crawls again and say, maybe we can do something with this. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. You don't produce any more of them, but it's certainly worth a try.
In hex crawling, it seems like math is a lot more important with regards to what the hex is representing within it. So mileage, basically. And so what I've seen from my research is that a lot of people like the 6 mile hex. Do you have an opinion on this?
I started with 6 mile. I don't know if it's superior to anything else. It seemed like it worked pretty well, because sometimes you're going to have folks on foot, sometimes on horseback, and it seems like it works. I suppose 12 or 18 would work just as well, or 5 and 10 and 15.
Do you try to keep things do you try to keep your maps divisible by 6?
Yeah, I do all the ones for Nod in 6 mile hexes, so that all of them basically will fit together and without any trouble.
When you start to understand why 6 miles is important, then you start looking at these other modules as like, well, why did they pick 14 miles? Why did they pick 25? Well,
Yeah.
It's an interesting topic, actually.
Yeah, and I thought at one point of going bigger, just as a way to, kind of the idea of, there's not enough encounters on all these hexes. Well, if I make the hexes bigger, then maybe I can pack the encounters in a little bit more, and just ultimately said, no, I've done so much stuff the other way. I'd have to kind of retrofit all of it, and it'd take forever. I'm not going to do that.
So have you been involved in hex crawls that were not run by you?
God, actually, no, I don't think I have. I mean, maybe I'm trying to remember. Back in the old days, they had the that known world gazetteers, which had hex maps, but it wasn't really a hex crawl. I don't know if I ever did anything though.
Shoot, I was going
back
to ask
then.
you.
Maybe that maybe Isle of Dread, because it was almost a hex crawl. That's probably about it.
I think Isle of Dread was supposed to be TSR's first official hex crawl.
Yeah, and it might have been. I don't know, but it was hexes, and there were things you could run into. But my memory is you primarily, well, especially again if you're 12 and 13, and you're not worried about the vagaries of navigation. You're pretty much going, well, I'm going to go straight south to this island where all the good stuff is. And I don't know that we encountered a whole lot otherwise. And then the island, yeah. I mean, I guess the island was hexcrawl too. That probably is the only other hexcrawl I ever was in that I wasn't running. Although now I'm thinking about it, I DM'd most of the time back then too, so I probably ran that one too.
Shoot, I was going to ask you to critique some DMs because it seems like the hex crawling is really like the cornerstone of a good hex crawl is the DM knowing how to hex crawl the right way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's true with everything you do if you're running a game. Is you gotta have some experience under your belt. You know, it's going to be rough initially. I always think the key is like just don't get too bogged down in the reality of it, right? I mean, you're going hex to hex. People are there to have a good time. There's going to be some logistics involved, that people got to figure out. But don't worry so much about that. Don't get into like, well, I need to determine the weather and I need to determine this and well, what's the chance they actually run across this when they enter the hex, dude? If they enter the hex, let them run into the thing that's there.
Good point.
Keep it simple. I mean, and I'm like that with DMing. I'm not a real hard ass about things. It's like we're all there to have a good time. You know, keep the barrier of entry relatively low so people aren't sitting there bored because they didn't do X, Y, and Z.
Do you like to put
and
time pressure on the players?
Well, I mean, in as much as you guys are running out of food, or or you can maybe set one up where it's like, hey, winter's coming and you need to get from here to here before the snows start falling, or else it's going to get harder. So you can have that aspect to it. I would always look at it as
or something like
sorry.
You have to use this key on a specific date to get inside the Lonely Mountain, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think if you're going to do it, make sure it's kind of embedded in the whole story, right? I mean, if people are going to run out of food, that should be an opportunity for okay, introduce something now that that'll help them get that food, but they're going to have to do something to get it. I mean, you could also just have the ranger go out and roll the dice and say you hunted and found a deer. You can do that too, but people are running low on food, and hey, there's the mysterious tower that happens to be there that I didn't plan on, but hey, this could be interesting, right? And they walk in, and oh, there's a whole banquet on this table, and that's weird. There's nobody there. I mean, you can use those any of those kind of environmental things. To me, should be an opportunity for I call it a side quest or call it whatever, or just a complication in the overall plot.
What would a good DM do wrong for a hex crawl?
Well, I mean, one thing is probably under preparing. I mean, you do need to read through it. You need to sort of plot out where things are. Um, it helps if you know the general path that people are going to be taking, because then you can specifically look at that area. If you're not quite sure, you need to maybe look for a broader area. You also need to excuse yourself if you mess up. I think that's big. So don't be super hard on yourself, but do some preparatory work. Have an idea of the movement rates and time and how all that works in whatever game you happen to be playing. But mostly just keep your eyes and ears open to what the players are up to, so you can keep them engaged, keep them challenged, that kind of thing. If you start working on hex crawl with players, you're going to need to have a little experience with it. So hopefully everybody will give it a little time to try to get into it. But if ultimately they really aren't enjoying it, then stop doing it. I mean, you could still use, like, if you have a hex crawl with some interesting encounters, you could still grab those encounters, but just let people encounter them in a different way and say, look, they're going from here to here. I need 2 good encounters on the road. I'll grab these two out of this hex crawl that I purchased or wrote or whatever, and just let them run into them naturally on the road, so to speak, and hand wave the rest of them.
Where can people find out more about you, John?
Well, I mean, best place probably is my blog, The Land of Nod, which I probably should know what the URL is. I have no idea. I just moved it to a WordPress blog. If you Google Land of Nod, John Stater, you'll find it. Yeah, it'll be out there. You can also find me on Google Plus, John Stater. And by the way, congratulations for pronouncing Stater right. Most people go Statter, so that was impressive. But you can find me there. Apparently, people talk about me on Reddit. I didn't even know that. So
they want to hear more, John. You gotta do more of these.
Apparently, they want to hear more. Yeah. Well, I guess I need to find more time and start a YouTube channel. I don't know when I'm going to do that.
I will include in the bottom in the comments links to all of the pertinent information that we talked about today, including your website. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you like the content. That's going to be it for now. BardicCollege.com signing off.